my honor and my privilege to co-anchor this CBC special order, this hour of power, so to speak, where members of the Congressional Black Caucus have an opportunity to speak directly to the American people today on an issue of great importance as it relates to the integrity of our democracy. Perhaps there's no more fundamental issue to preserving the integrity of the great democracy that we have here in America than the right to vote. The right to vote is something that should be cherished, something that should be protected, something that should be respected. But the right to vote has not always been treated in this fashion, in this republic of ours. During the founding of this country, we know, of course, that African Americans were largely excluded from being able to participate in our democracy as a result of the conditions of their enslavement. In 1869, this Congress came together and sent to the states for ratification the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, an amendment that was designed to remedy the situation related to the failure to meaningfully include African Americans in our democracy. It was designed to provide constitutional protection, to limit the ability of states to disenfranchise individuals on the basis of race, color, or prior conditions of servitude. Yet we understand that for about 100 years subsequent to the passage and ratification of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, it was largely evaded in many parts of America as a result of legislative schemes that were devised to prohibit or limit the ability of African Americans and other communities of color to participate in our democracy. These legislative schemes took many forms. Some have already called the names: poll taxes and grandfather clauses and literacy tests. Legislative schemes devised to limit the ability of African Americans and others to participate in this glorious democracy of ours. A large part of it took place in the Deep South, but there were instances of this all over America. And Mr. Speaker, that is why the Congress came back in the midst of the turbulent era of the 1960s and passed the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which included a Section 5 pre-clearance provision that was designed to require those covered jurisdictions all of 16 states to get approval from either the Department of Justice or a 3-judge federal court panel here in Washington, D.C., whenever any of these jurisdictions sought to change a law with respect to voting. The rationale for this Section 5 pre-clearance requirement was because in these covered jurisdictions there was a history of discrimination as it related to the franchise. Deliberate schemes designed to limit the ability of American citizens to participate in our democracy. And as a result of this history, the Section 5 pre-clearance requirement was put into place. And it has worked. Over the close to 5 decades that it has been in effect. It is perhaps the most successful piece of civil rights legislation that this Congress has passed. Now, as a result of its success, there are some who have contended that it is no longer a relevant provision of law, and that when the Congress came together in bipartisan fashion in 2006 to reauthorize this provision that this body, the House of Representatives and the Senate, which passed the reauthorization 98-0, Democrats and Republicans, the contention is that this body exceeded its constitutional authority because Section 5 allegedly, according to the defenders of disenfranchisement, is no longer relevant. Now, in the aftermath of Barack Obama's historic election in 2008, there was a Supreme Court case involving Austin, Texas, I believe, in 2009, that was heard just a few months after his inauguration. And part of the argument that was made in that Supreme Court case by those who sought to invalidate Section 5's preclearance requirement was that as a result of this historic election of Barack Obama, race seems no longer to be an issue in America. And they pointed to the elevation of Barack Obama to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, of course, that was an extremely important moment in the history of our republic. It was a substantial step forward. But the reality is that the election of Barack Obama has also served to illustrate that in America there's still some issues of race that we've got to confront. It's interesting because if you look at the election of presidents since the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, it's unprecedented in the aftermath of President Obama's election to have seen the level of voter suppression laws and efforts that we were forced to confront in this country. These efforts presumably are based on the thin claim that those who are advancing these laws were trying to guard against fraud. No evidence of fraud, but those who are advancing these voter suppression laws attempting to guard against fraud. But when you look at the record, what's fascinating is that when Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, there was no explosion of concern for alleged fraud. He was reelected in 1972, no explosion of concern for alleged fraud. And then Jimmy Carter's elected in 1976, no explosion of concern for alleged fraud. And then Ronald Reagan's elected in 1980 and reelected in 1984, no explosion of concern for alleged fraud. George H.W. Bush, elected in 1988, no explosion of concern of alleged fraud. Bill Clinton, elected in 1992, re-elected in 1996, and no explosion of concern for alleged fraud. George W. Bush, elected, some would argue under questionable circumstances, given the dynamics in the great state of Florida. But again, no explosion of concern related to alleged fraud. The same was true in 2004, notwithstanding some concerns in the great state of Ohio. No explosion of concern for alleged fraud. Yet, Barack Obama is elected in 2008. And all of a sudden, in the aftermath of this historic election, there's an outbreak of concern, a pandemic of anxiety as it relates to the fraud that allegedly is taking place in America. And so, as this chart illustrates, it is a wonderful chart that was prepared by the Brennan Center of Justice in my home state of New York,